Plane crashes are some of the most intense and heartbreaking events in aviation history. I'm talking about disasters where fate could have gone either way, but in the end, lives were lost and lessons were learned in the hardest ways. Starting off with a terrifying crash that changed aviation forever. Japan Airlines Flight 123. Now this one is straight up terrifying. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a slow-motion nightmare that played out over 32 excruciating minutes. On August 12, 1985, 524 people boarded a routine domestic flight from Tokyo to Osaka, expecting a quick, uneventful trip. What they got was one of the most terrifying plane crashes in history, with only 4 survivors. 12 minutes after takeoff, a loud explosion rocked the aircraft. Passengers probably thought it was turbulence at first, but then the plane started violently shaking and losing altitude. The rear pressure bulkhead had blown out, and the force of the decompression tore off a huge chunk of the tail. That alone was bad, but it also completely disabled the hydraulic system, meaning the pilots had zero control. No steering, no stabilizers, nothing. Their only option, trying to guide this massive Boeing 747 using engine thrust alone, which is about as effective as trying to steer a runaway train by shifting your weight. Most crashes happen in seconds, but Flight 123 stayed in the air for over half an hour, swaying dangerously as the pilots struggled to keep it stable. The passengers knew what was coming. Some wrote heartbreaking goodbye notes to their families, scribbling final messages on napkins and seat covers as the plane spiraled toward disaster. Some people even sang songs together to stay calm. Can you imagine being in that situation? Watching everything fall apart and knowing exactly how it would end. Finally, the aircraft slammed into Mount Takamagahara at over 350 miles per hour, hitting the mountain so hard that it bounced off one ridge before exploding into another. It was an absolute horror show with twisted metal, flames, and debris scattered across the mountainside. And here's the part that makes it even worse. Rescue teams waited over 12 hours to reach the site, assuming there were no survivors. But when they finally got there, they found 4 people still alive in the wreckage. If help had arrived sooner, more might have been saved. The reason for this disaster? A botched repair job. 7 years earlier, Boeing had badly patched a previous tail strike, leaving a weak spot that finally gave out mid-flight. One lazy mistake led to the demise of 520 people and became a horrifying reminder of how one bad decision can cause total disaster. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was the complete opposite. A disaster that should have been avoided, but miraculously left most passengers alive. Imagine coming in for a landing, watching the ground get closer, and thinking everything is normal, until suddenly, the plane slams into the runway tail first, skids out of control, and bursts into flames. That's exactly what happened to Asiana Airlines Flight 214 on July 6, 2013 in San Francisco. This wasn't some mid-air explosion or mechanical failure. Nope, this was pure pilot error, and it was all caught on camera. Flight 214 was a routine trip from Seoul, South Korea to San Francisco, carrying 307 people. The flight had been smooth, up until the pilots completely miscalculated the landing. As the Boeing 777 approached the runway, it was coming in way too low and too slow, basically a recipe for disaster. The pilots didn't realize their mistake until it was too late. By the time they tried to correct it, the plane was already about to hit the ground. The tail smashed into the seawall at the end of the runway, shearing off entire sections of the fuselage and sending the plane spinning out of control. The impact was brutal. Parts of the aircraft broke apart, seats ripped from the floor, and passengers were thrown around like rag dolls. Thick, black smoke started pouring out as flames engulfed the plane. Insanely enough, most people survived this incident. Out of 307 passengers and crew, 304 made it out alive. 3 teenage girls from China, however, passed away. one of them after being run over by a fire truck in the chaotic rescue operation. The crash investigation was just as shocking as the accident itself. Turns out, the pilots had relied too much on autopilot and didn't properly monitor their airspeed. They ignored warnings that they were flying too low, and by the time they reacted, there was nothing they could do. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, ripped into Asiana Airlines, blaming the pilots for their lack of basic flying skills. The footage of the crash, which was captured in broad daylight, became one of the most widely shared aviation disaster videos of all time. A plane crash where almost everyone walks away is rare, but Asiana 214 proved that a split-second mistake can turn an ordinary landing into a fiery catastrophe. If Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was a crash caused by one bad landing, the Tenerife Airport disaster was the result of a perfect storm of mistakes, miscommunication, and pure bad luck. To this day, it remains the fatal aviation accident in history, with 583 people deceased in a horrific, fiery collision between two jumbo jets. It all happened on March 27, 1977, at Los Rodeos Airport, now Tenerife North Airport in the Canary Islands. Two fully loaded Boeing 747s, one operated by KLM, the other by Pan Am, were stuck at the airport because of a bomb threat at their original destination, Gran Canaria. The weather was awful, with thick fog covering the runway, making it almost impossible to see anything. That's when things spiraled into chaos. The KLM jet, already delayed, was trying to take off, while the Pan Am flight was still on the same runway, taxiing in the fog. Here's where the miscommunication turned fatal. The KLM captain, eager to get going, thought he had clearance for takeoff, but he didn't. The Pan Am crew, meanwhile, couldn't see the other plane coming and had no idea what was about to happen. With visibility near zero, both planes were completely blind to each other. Then came the moment of absolute disaster. The KLM 747 roared down the runway at full speed, heading straight for Pan Am. At the last second, the Pan Am pilots spotted the incoming jet and desperately tried to turn off the runway, but it was too late. The KLM plane lifted its nose, attempting to clear the Pan Am aircraft, but its landing gear and engines smashed into the upper deck, ripping it apart and igniting a massive fireball. The KLM jet slammed back onto the runway, exploding on impact. The aftermath was pure horror. Everyone on the KLM flight, which included 248 people, passed away instantly. On the Pan Am plane, 335 people perished, but miraculously, 61 people survived, escaping through the wreckage before the fire engulfed the aircraft. The investigation blamed a combination of pilot error, miscommunication with air traffic control, and terrible weather conditions. If the Tenerife disaster proved that a few seconds of miscommunication could lead to history's most fatal crash, Air France Flight 4590 showed that sometimes disaster strikes from the smallest, most unexpected cause. This was the crash that ended the era of supersonic passenger travel, bringing down the legendary Concorde in a fiery inferno that no one saw coming. The Concorde was supposed to be the future of air travel, a sleek, supersonic jet that could fly at twice the speed of sound, cutting travel time in half. It had a perfect safety record for over 25 years, but on July 25, 2000, that reputation was obliterated in less than 2 minutes. Air France Flight 4590 was departing from Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport, headed for New York. Everything seemed routine until a tiny metal strip just 17 inches long fell onto the runway. This little piece of debris had fallen off a Continental Airlines DC-10 that had taken off minutes earlier. It shouldn't have been a big deal, but as the Concorde sped down the runway, one of its tires ran over the metal, burst, and sent a chunk of rubber flying into the fuel tank. That's when all hell broke loose. The impact ruptured the fuel tank, and within seconds, a massive fire erupted under the left wing. Passengers on board probably had no idea what was happening, but the plane was already doomed. The pilots tried to gain altitude, but the fire knocked out one of the engines. Flames poured from the aircraft, trailing behind it as it struggled to climb. Less than a minute after takeoff, the left wing completely failed, and the Concorde veered sharply, crashing into a hotel just outside the airport in a massive fireball. All 109 people on board passed away instantly, along with 4 more on the ground. The Concorde was already on borrowed time, but this disaster sealed its fate. Investigators blamed the runway debris, weak fuel tank design, and a chain reaction of failures. The entire Concorde fleet was grounded, and despite modifications, it was retired for good in 2003. Just like that, the dream of supersonic passenger travel ended in flames, all because of a tiny strip of metal that never should have been there. If the Concorde crash proved that even the smallest debris can bring down a technological marvel, Turkish Airlines Flight TK-1951 showed that a tiny sensor glitch could send a modern airliner straight into the ground. This was a crash that should have never happened, but in just a few seconds, a routine landing turned into total disaster. On February 25, 2009, Turkish Airlines Flight TK-1951 was making its final approach to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport after a flight from Istanbul. It was a standard Boeing 737, a model known for being one of the safest planes in the world. But safety means nothing when your plane thinks it's already on the ground, when it isn't. That's exactly what happened. One of the plane's radio altimeters, a crucial sensor that tells the aircraft its height above the ground, malfunctioned. It wrongly reported that the plane was at 0 feet, even though it was still way up in the air. The autopilot responded by cutting engine power, thinking the aircraft had already landed. But instead of touching down safely, the plane started falling out of the sky. The pilots didn't realize the problem until it was too late. By the time they tried to increase power, the plane had already lost too much speed, sending it into a dangerous stall. The 737 plummeted, smashing into a muddy field just short of the runway. The tail snapped off, the fuselage cracked into 3 massive pieces, and debris went flying everywhere. 9 people passed away, including all 3 pilots, while 126 others were injured, many of them seriously. The weirdest part? This should have been completely preventable. The faulty altimeter had already malfunctioned on previous flights, but no one had taken it seriously enough. And when the stall warning went off, the pilots had just 7 seconds to react, barely enough time to process what was happening. The crash sent shockwaves through the aviation industry, proving that even the most advanced autopilot systems can fail catastrophically if pilots don't catch the problem in time. Since then, airlines have revised their training protocols to ensure pilots know how to spot and override faulty sensors before it's too late. But for Flight TK-1951, those changes came 9 lives too late. If Turkish Airlines Flight TK-1951 showed how a single sensor failure could send a plane plummeting, Air Canada Flight 143 proved that you don't even need an engine to survive. That is, if you have the right pilot. This was the unbelievable story of a jet that ran out of fuel mid-air, but somehow made it to the ground in one piece, earning it the legendary nickname, the Gimli Glider. On July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 was flying from Montreal to Edmonton with 69 people on board. It was a brand new Boeing 767, one of the first jets to use a fully electronic cockpit, which should have made flying even safer. But this time, technology was part of the problem. The disaster started with a tiny math mistake. Air Canada had just switched to the metric system, and ground crews miscalculated the amount of fuel needed for the flight. Instead of 22,300 kilograms, they loaded just 22,300 pounds, less than half the necessary fuel. But here's the crazy part. Nobody noticed. Everything seemed fine until the plane was cruising at 41,000 feet, when suddenly, the left engine stopped working. The pilots were confused. Modern jets don't just shut off midair. Then, the right engine went out too. That's when it hit them. They were completely out of fuel. The plane had become a 132-ton glider, and they had nowhere near enough altitude to reach their destination. Most pilots would have panicked, but Captain Bob Pearson was no ordinary pilot. He also happened to be a skilled glider pilot, and he knew exactly what to do. With zero engine power, he had to glide the massive jet down safely, finding the closest possible landing spot before gravity took over. That spot turned out to be an abandoned Air Force base in Gimli, Manitoba, which, unbeknownst to the pilots, had been turned into a racetrack. As Pearson lined up for landing, he realized there were cars and spectators on the runway. With no hydraulic power, he used a glider trick called a side slip, tilting the plane sideways to slow it down. The 767 touched down hard, skidding down the track and coming to a stop just short of disaster. Miraculously, no one was seriously hurt, and Air Canada Flight 143 went down as one of the craziest, luckiest landings in aviation history. The Gimli glider proved that sometimes a crash isn't really a crash. It's just an emergency landing with style. If Air Canada Flight 143 proved that sheer skill and luck could save a plane from disaster, the 1996 Charkhi Dadri mid-air collision was the tragic reminder that sometimes there's no way out. This wasn't just a crash. It was two massive jets slamming into each other mid-air, turning the sky into one of the most terrifying aviation scenes ever recorded. On November 12, 1996, Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 took off from New Delhi's Indira Gandhi International Airport, headed for Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. At the same time, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 was approaching the airport. Both planes were huge. One was a Boeing 747, the other an Ilyushin Il-76, carrying a total of 349 people between them. But there was a problem. They were flying toward each other on the same path. The Kazakhstan pilot misunderstood his altitude clearance, accidentally descending into the exact airspace occupied by the Saudi plane. In the thick haze of the evening sky, neither crew saw the other coming. At 14,000 feet, the two jets collided head-on with a force that instantly shattered both aircraft. The Kazakh plane's tail sliced through the Saudi jet's fuselage, sending flaming debris raining down over the village of Charkhi Dadri. The horror was immediate. The Saudi flight broke apart mid-air, while the Kazakh plane spiraled out of control before smashing into the ground. In mere seconds, 349 people passed away and no survivors. It remains the most terrifying example of how a single miscommunication can wipe out hundreds of lives in an instant. Investigators found that Kazakhstan's pilots weren't properly trained in English, leading to dangerous misunderstandings with air traffic control. But the biggest lesson? The crash led to major changes in air traffic management, including the mandatory use of traffic collision avoidance systems, a technology that automatically warns pilots if another plane is too close. The collision raised crucial questions about air traffic control systems, safety protocols, and pilot training. Though the changes following this tragedy saved lives in the future, for the passengers of the two planes, those changes came far too late. One moment, they were flying normally. The next, the sky itself turned against them. This crash serves as a chilling reminder that a single misstep in aviation can lead to catastrophic consequences. If the 1996 Charkhi Dadri mid-air collision proved that even the smallest miscommunication can lead to utter catastrophe, the crash of UPS Airlines Flight 6 in 2010 highlighted how even the most experienced crew and seemingly routine flights can be turned into a disaster, all because of fire and smoke that spread too fast to stop. On September 3, 2010, UPS Airlines Flight 6, a Boeing 747-400F, was en route from Louisville, Kentucky to Dubai. The plane was carrying air freight, as it usually did, and everything seemed like another typical cargo flight. Captain Dave Barnes and First Officer Matt Bell had years of flying experience and were in control of what should have been a standard journey. But just 14 minutes into the flight, things went horribly wrong. The cargo hold of this Boeing 747 was filled with highly flammable material, specifically lithium-ion batteries. During the climb out of Louisville, one of the batteries caught fire. The fire spread quickly, undetected, and eventually the smoke began seeping into the cockpit. Within minutes, the cockpit became overwhelmed with smoke, rendering it difficult for the pilots to see or breathe properly. But the worst part? They couldn't determine where the fire was, and they had no clear idea of how to stop it. By the time they tried to turn back to Louisville, the situation was already out of control. The fire spread too rapidly. Even though the flight crew deployed the fire suppression system, it was no match for the intense flames. The pilots tried everything to regain control, but at around 24,000 feet, the fire destroyed the plane's electrical systems, making it impossible for the pilots to maintain control. The aircraft went into an uncontrollable dive. Despite their best efforts, both crew members perished as the plane crashed near Baxter, Kentucky. The cause of the crash was traced back to the flammable cargo and how the fire suppression system failed to contain it. The incident raised alarms about safety regulations surrounding cargo shipments of lithium-ion batteries and prompted revisions to fire safety protocols for cargo planes. The tragedy of UPS Flight 6 underscored how a seemingly ordinary flight could turn into a disaster due to a fire that no one could stop. If UPS Airlines Flight 6 showed that even the best trained pilots can fall victim to a catastrophic, undetected fire, then TransAsia Airways Flight 235 was a heart-stopping reminder that even a slight malfunction in a critical engine can spiral into an unimaginable disaster, all in the blink of an eye. This was a case where a single engine failure quickly turned a routine flight into a fight for survival. On February 4, 2015, TransAsia Airways Flight 235 took off from Taipei Songshan Airport in Taiwan, heading to Kinmen Island. The flight was short, just about 130 miles, but it was also supposed to be routine. The Airbus A320 was carrying 58 people, all seemingly safe and secure in the air. However, less than 2 minutes after takeoff, things started to go horribly wrong. Just after the plane climbed into the air, one of its engines failed. This wasn't a total failure. It was a partial loss of power, enough to throw off the balance and force the pilots into a split-second decision. The crew tried to switch to the other engine, but things went from bad to worse. During the confusion, they made a fatal mistake. They shut down the wrong engine, leaving the plane with no power at all on the only engine left. Now, the plane was plummeting toward the ground, with no power, no altitude, and precious little time to recover. The pilots attempted to regain control, but they were struggling with the aircraft's failing systems. Meanwhile, a disturbing message was being broadcast live. The cockpit voice recorder revealed the panic and desperation in the voices of the pilots. They were fighting not just the airplane, but also their own mistakes. The plane crashed into the Keelung River, and 43 people were deceased while 15 others survived. The wreckage was a horrifying sight. An airplane half submerged in water, the remains of an attempt at survival. If UPS Airlines Flight 6 demonstrated how fire and flammable materials can cause a disaster too fast to prevent, then the October 4th, 1992 crash of LL Flight 1862 was a terrifying reminder that sometimes even minor mechanical failures can escalate into a race against time, with some very big consequences. In this case, a failure in 2 engines sent the plane into a never-ending descent, threatening to crash into a densely populated area. On October 4th, 1992, LL Flight 1862 took off from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, bound for Tel Aviv. It was a routine cargo flight operating a Boeing 747 with 47 people on board. However, just 7 minutes after takeoff, everything went wrong. The right wing's 2 engines suddenly failed, leaving the aircraft with just 2 engines working on the left wing. At first, the crew tried to keep things under control, but the loss of power on the right wing caused the plane to yaw dangerously, a sideways movement that made it harder to maintain altitude. The pilots were quickly faced with an impossible decision: return to Schiphol or try to make it to a nearby airfield. With each passing second, the plane's descent became more aggressive. As they descended lower and lower, the situation grew more dire. By this point, the pilots were facing a race against time, desperately trying to find a safe place to land. But as the aircraft descended rapidly, it became clear that they would not make it to the airport. With the aircraft plummeting toward the city, the pilots tried everything they could to steer the plane away from residential areas. However, they didn't succeed. At just 1,500 feet, the plane collided with an 11-story apartment complex in Amsterdam's Bijlmermeer district. The crash was devastating. All 47 people on board passed away, along with at least 39 people on the ground. The wreckage left behind a scene of utter destruction, with massive fires and collapsed buildings. The cause of the crash was found to be a mechanical failure of the engine pylon, which led to the loss of power in both engines on the right wing. The tragic event prompted significant changes in aircraft safety standards and highlighted how a seemingly routine flight can suddenly turn into a race against time when things start to go wrong. Despite their best efforts, the pilots were unable to avoid disaster, and the crash serves as a chilling reminder that even small failures can have catastrophic consequences. So what did you think? Did these mind-blowing crashes make you rethink what you know about air travel? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.